Every office has its hierarchy. In ours, it wasn't talent, performance, or years of hard work that determined who rose to the top, it was bloodlines. At the pinnacle sat Mr. Hawthorne, the formidable CEO who had built the company into a powerhouse. He was sharp, cutthroat, and absolutely loyal to one thing: profit. Below him trickled down layers of ambitious managers, stressed employees, and exhausted assistants, all trying to please him or at least avoid his wrath. Into this carefully constructed empire walked Jason Hawthorne, the CEO's only son. He didn't climb the ladder. He was dropped straight onto the executive floor. Jason's first day wasn't marked by humility or eagerness to learn. Instead, he strode in like a prince inheriting his kingdom, barking orders to people twice his age and dismissing their input without listening. His shiny degree from an Ivy League university was paraded around as proof of his brilliance. But everyone knew it was the Hawthorne name, not merit. That landed him the role of Vice President of Operations. From day one, Jason made the office unbearable. He treated junior staff as personal assistants, sending them on coffee runs and berating them if the order wasn't exactly right. He routinely showed up late to meetings, cut people off mid-sentence, and then shamelessly presented their ideas as his own to the board. Worse, he was reckless with contracts, authorizations, and company money. He skimmed through important documents, signed without reading, and shrugged off legal warnings. Whenever those decisions backfired, he simply blamed someone else, and it worked. Who was going to challenge him? He was the CEO's son. HR complaints mysteriously disappeared. Those who resisted Jason's bullying found themselves reassigned, demoted, or suddenly let go due to restructuring. I had managed to stay under his radar at least for a while. My role in compliance and contract management kept me tethered to the fine print of deals, the small details most executives ignored. I wasn't flashy, I wasn't loud, and I certainly didn't play politics. But I was thorough. I knew every clause, every loophole, every risky line buried in the hundreds of pages of agreements that kept our company afloat. In a business built on appearances, I worked in the shadows. Jason, of course, didn't care about shadows. He cared about spotlight. And he craved the admiration of his father. That meant he would bulldoze over anyone, no matter how small. If it meant looking competent, the office atmosphere under Jason became suffocating. People worked longer hours just to cover his mistakes. He'd cancel meetings last minute and demand rescheduled ones at midnight. He threw tantrums in boardrooms, slamming fists on tables like a child denied a toy. Yet whenever Mr. Hawthorne visited the floor, Jason transformed into a polished, confident leader, reciting buzzwords and empty promises with the ease of a seasoned politician. The CEO would beam with pride, blind to the chaos his son left in his wake. But things escalated when Jason decided to make me his next scapegoat. It began with a high-profile client deal Jason mishandled. He ignored the legal red flags, promised terms we couldn't possibly deliver, and ultimately drove the client away. Instead of owning up, he publicly humiliated me in a meeting, pointing at me in front of a dozen colleagues and claiming I had failed to review the contract properly. I stood frozen, knowing every word was a lie, but also knowing no one would dare contradict him. The room stayed silent, except for Jason's voice cutting through like a knife. That moment crystallized something inside me. Until then, I had tolerated the office toxicity as just another cost of surviving in corporate life. But being blamed for Jason's mistake wasn't just insulting, it was dangerous. If his lie stuck, it could mean my career. That was the spark, the turning point. Jason believed himself untouchable, armored by his father's name. But arrogance, I knew, often blinds people to the smallest details. And in the fine print, in the shadows of contracts, Jason never bothered to read, lay the tools I would need to bring him down. After that humiliating meeting, my name circulated in whispers. People in the office avoided eye contact, not because they believed Jason's lie, but because aligning with the wrong person could be career suicide. In our company, perception was reality and Jason controlled the narrative. He strutted through the halls, self-satisfied, acting as if his outburst had been a masterstroke of leadership. For me, the humiliation was only the beginning. A day later, Jason summoned me into his glass-walled office. His tone was casual, but his words were sharp enough to draw blood. "You're going to fix this," he said, tossing a folder onto his desk. "The client is furious, but if you work overtime and adjust the terms, maybe we can salvage it. Otherwise—" he leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Maybe this company doesn't need someone in your position." I kept my face neutral, but inside anger bubbled. He wanted me to rewrite an entire contract overnight to clean up a disaster entirely of his making, and then pretend it had been my mistake all along. I wasn't just his scapegoat, I was supposed to be his safety net. The next few weeks followed the same rhythm. Jason would blunder. I would be ordered to quietly correct it, and he would take credit if it succeeded. If it failed, the blame was shoved onto me. I became the office punching bag. The one person Jason felt safe to corner because he knew my role was quiet, invisible, and easily discarded, but he underestimated me. My background wasn't just compliance, it was survival. I had built my career on reading between the lines, catching the details others missed. Jason, with his arrogance and recklessness, was the complete opposite. And the more he pushed me, the more I began to see opportunities in his mistakes. One night, after Jason stormed out early to hit some exclusive party, I stayed behind, sifting through a pile of documents he had left unsigned. Buried in that stack were contracts, amendments, and supplier agreements he had approved without a second glance. I noticed patterns, clauses skipped, terms ignored, whole sections brushed over. Each one was a potential disaster waiting to erupt. That's when the idea began to form. Jason had power, yes. He had his father's protection. But power like his was fragile. It depended on the illusion of competence. All it would take was one undeniable mistake, something too big to bury, too clear to spin, to crack that illusion. And the best part? Jason was the one handing me the ammunition every time he scribbled his signature without reading. The more I thought about it, the clearer my path became. I didn't need to fight Jason in the open. That was suicide. No, I would let him build his own downfall brick by brick, and when the time came, I'd only need to point out the cracks. The breaking point wasn't a single event. It was a slow burn. Each insult, each late-night demand, each public humiliation piled onto the fire until it was unbearable. But the final push came during another meeting, weeks after that first public shaming. Jason had once again made promises to a potential client that were impossible to deliver. When I hesitated to nod along with his lies, he slammed his fist on the table and sneered, "You'll do as I say. You work for me, not the other way around. Don't forget that." That line echoed in my head long after the meeting ended. I realized then that Jason wasn't just careless. He was dangerous. He wasn't content with wrecking deals. He wanted total control, even if it meant destroying the people under him. And if I didn't stop him, I wouldn't just lose my job. I'd lose my dignity. So I made a quiet vow to myself that night I would stop him. Not with yelling, not with defiance, those would be crushed easily. No, I would stop him using the very thing he despised. Details. The fine print? The clauses he ignored. Jason thought he was invincible because his father shielded him. What he didn't realize was that I had already begun looking for the perfect flaw. The fatal clause hidden in the paperwork he dismissed as boring. The trap was being set. Revenge, I quickly learned, isn't born in grand gestures, it's born in silence. In the patient turning of pages that no one else bothers to read. While Jason strutted around like a king, I became invisible. He liked me that way, quiet, compliant, someone he could dump work on and forget about. But invisibility has its uses. It let me dig through the paper trail he left behind like breadcrumbs scattered by arrogance. Most nights, the office emptied out by 8. By 10, only the cleaning staff and I remained. I sat at my desk under the dull hum of fluorescent lights, sifting through contracts Jason had signed off without hesitation. Deals with suppliers, service agreements, renewal terms, all bearing his careless signature. Most people would see endless jargon. I saw risk and eventually opportunity. It happened one Thursday night, months into my quiet search. I was combing through a contract with one of our overseas suppliers. Jason had personally handled the renewal well. Handled was generous. His notes on the file were a sloppy scrawl. Standard renewal, sign and move on. He hadn't read past the title page, but buried in section 14.3 was a clause that froze me in my chair. It was what's known in legal circles as a performance penalty. Trigger a little-known clause that allowed the supplier to demand full payment of projected 3-year revenue if certain conditions weren't met. Usually, companies negotiate it down or remove it altogether. But Jason, he hadn't even noticed it. His signature and initials were right there in ink, binding the company to terms that could, if invoked, cost tens of millions. I read it again, slowly, making sure fatigue wasn't warping the words. No, there it was, plain as day. One clause, overlooked and ignored, sitting like a live grenade in our contract portfolio. And Jason had armed it himself. At first, I felt panic. If the supplier ever decided to enforce this clause, it would be catastrophic. The kind of catastrophe that made shareholders revolt and boards turn bloodthirsty. Then, as the panic settled, something colder, sharper slid into place. Realization. This was it. This was Jason's undoing. Of course, I couldn't act immediately. If I stormed into the CEO's office waving the contract, it would look like sabotage. Worse, Jason would twist the narrative and pin it on me again. I needed more proof that this was his blunder alone, with no room for doubt or deflection. So I started collecting. I traced the paper trail: Jason's emails dismissing legal reviews, his notes telling staff to stop wasting time on fine print, his impatient scribbles brushing aside suggested edits. Every document tied the signature back to him. Piece by piece, I built a case airtight enough that even his father couldn't ignore it. Meanwhile, Jason kept digging his own grave. He bragged in meetings about closing tough deals and mocked those who worried about the legal minutiae. "That's why we have compliance nerds," he once laughed, smirking in my direction. I smiled politely, knowing the irony would crush him soon enough. What made it even sweeter was that Jason, in his arrogance, began parading the supplier contract as one of his big wins. He told the board how he'd streamlined the process and saved weeks of negotiation. He didn't realize that what he'd actually done was hand the supplier a weapon. The more I thought about it, the more poetic it seemed. Jason's downfall would come not from sabotage, not from office politics, but from his own arrogance. He signed the clause, he ignored the warnings, and he bragged about it. When the time came, no one could claim I had set him up. That night, staring at the glowing contract on my monitor, I leaned back in my chair and allowed myself the first genuine smile in months. Jason had always thought the fine print was beneath him. He was wrong. The hidden clause wasn't just a trap, it was a mirror. And when the right moment came, I would hold it up for everyone to see. Finding the hidden clause was like spotting a crack in the armor of a giant. But a crack alone doesn't topple a giant. You need patience, pressure, and timing. If I moved too quickly, Jason would find a way to spin it, maybe even bury me in the process. So I chose the one weapon Jason never used: restraint. I began quietly building my arsenal. First, documentation. Every email he fired off dismissing legal reviews, every hastily scribbled note, every signed page, I saved them all. I even made copies of his infamous late-night memos where he mocked compliance people for slowing him down. He thought his arrogance was harmless posturing, but on paper it was damning. I wasn't just collecting evidence. I was stitching together a noose. Next, I needed witnesses. Jason's bullying had left a trail of resentment across departments. The junior analysts he screamed at, the assistants he treated like servants, the managers forced to cover his mistakes, they all carried scars. I didn't need them to take action, just to remember. So I began subtle conversations in the break room, planting seeds. I listened more than I spoke, letting them vent about Jason's abuses. I filed away every story, every detail, knowing that when the time came, the board would need more than my voice alone. Meanwhile, Jason kept giving me ammunition without realizing it. He strutted around bragging about the supplier deal, holding it up as his signature accomplishment. In one board update, he even called it bulletproof. I almost laughed aloud. Bulletproof? He was standing on a landmine. I decided to help him dig his hole deeper. During meetings, I played the role of the dutiful subordinate. If Jason dismissed a concern, I nodded. If he inflated his own success, I offered a polite smile. Sometimes I'd drop subtle suggestions that fed his ego, like, "You really streamlined that contract process. It must have saved so much time." He'd puff up, repeating the line to the board later as if it were his own observation. Every word he spoke was rope I would later use to tighten the knot. The beauty of revenge isn't in the strike. It's in the anticipation. I could see the moment coming closer, day by day, like watching storm clouds gather on the horizon. The supplier had been quiet so far, but contracts like these aren't accidents. They're traps. And when they decided to pull the trigger, Jason's signature would glow like a spotlight in a dark room, but I couldn't just wait for the storm. I needed to ensure when it broke, Jason had no escape. So I began drafting my own report, neutral in tone, clinical in language, but precise in its detail. It outlined the clause, the risk, the projected financial impact, and most importantly, the signature chain. At the end of the report sat Jason's initials, circled in neat red ink. I locked the file away, waiting for the day it would become my blade. At the same time, I kept my demeanor calm, almost submissive. Jason, drunk on his own invincibility, barely noticed me anymore. That was his biggest mistake. Predators don't look for threats in the quiet shadows, they look for defiance. And I gave him none. To him, I was just another cog in his machine. To me, he was already a marked man, walking straight toward his downfall. Then the signs began to surface, rumors of supply delays. Emails from the supplier with more aggressive language. Tension creeping into executive discussions about fulfillment guarantees. Jason waved it all off, insisting everything was under control. He even boasted, "That contract's airtight, they can't touch us." That was when I knew the storm had arrived. The trap wasn't just set, it was primed. All I had to do was wait for the inevitable moment when the supplier would invoke the clause and Jason's empire of arrogance would crumble in front of everyone. And I would be there, silent and prepared to light the fuse. The morning the supplier called, the office felt unnaturally quiet, like the calm before a building collapses. I got the message at 7:43 a.m., terse, formal, and absolute. They were invoking the performance penalty trigger. They wanted immediate remediation, either a lump sum settlement equal to 3 years' projected revenue, or they would terminate the partnership and seek damages. The words on the screen looked surreal, like a bad dream someone else was having. I felt my stomach drop and then, oddly, a cold clarity. The moment I had prepared for had arrived. I didn't race into the CEO's office with accusations. That would have been theater, and theater in our company was always choreographed in favor of the powerful. Instead, I moved with the same methodical precision I'd used to build my case. First, I archived the supplier's notice, time-stamped and unedited. Next, I pulled together the report I'd been refining for weeks, the one that laid out, in clinical terms, the clause, its implications, and the sign trail that tied it directly to Jason. I printed copies, circled the critical lines, and highlighted Jason's initials in red. Then I made discreet calls to a few colleagues, those I trusted to remain impartial, asking them to be in the meeting room in case the board needed corroboration. When I stepped into the emergency board meeting, the room was a storm of controlled panic. Mr. Hawthorne's face, usually unreadable and composed, was a landscape of fury. Jason sat at the center like a child caught with his hand in the cookie jar, trying to look defiant and failing. He opened his mouth to speak, he always did, but the supplier's letter had already begun to speak louder than he could. The CEO presented the supplier's demand first, the contract language, a timeline of missed deliverables and the monetary exposure. He looked to Jason for explanations. Jason stammered, tried to pivot, named subordinates who had failed to carry out his instructions, and finally muttered about unforeseen circumstances. His excuses slid off like water on glass. The board needed answers, not platitudes. That was my cue. I stood up, deliberately calm, and placed my report on the table. The room hushed. I didn't dramatize. I didn't shout. I explained the clause succinctly, where it was located, what it stipulated, why it was enforceable, and how current events had triggered it. Then I laid out the paper trail emails in which Jason dismissed legal reviews. a memo instructing staff not to waste time on fine print, and most damning, the signed renewal with his initials right beside Section 14.3. I walked the board through the timeline, step by step, showing how each decision linked back to him. At first, incredulity flickered across a few faces. No one wanted to believe a scion of the Hawthorne line had been so careless. Then the facts settled in like winter. Mr. Hawthorne's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked to his son and then to the stack of documents. Jason's face, once so pale with arrogance, drained into something much worse, pure terror. He tried to argue, to deflect, to accuse me of manufacturing the evidence, but his voice sounded small, thin. The signatures and emails were dated and archived. The language of the contract was explicit. There was no spin that could save him. The board deliberated in clipped, business-like tones, but their decisions carried a personal weight. They had to think about investors, about reputational damage, and about fiduciary duty. What had been an internal family mess had become an existential threat to the company. In the end, the decision was inevitable. Jason was removed from his operational responsibilities pending an external audit. The CEO demanded remediation talks with the supplier. Quietly, he arranged for Jason to be reassigned, for the good of the family and the company, to a satellite office where he could not do further harm. The aftermath wasn't a public spectacle. The company moved quickly to contain fallout. Damage control statements, emergency negotiations, and a flurry of legal consultations. Jason was escorted out of the office with a face that said he understood only the humiliation, not the consequences. Mr. Hawthorne avoided looking at him in meetings for weeks. Their conversations were terse and private. For me, there was no triumphant victory lap. I had expected a rush of satisfaction, but the only feeling was a hollow, steady relief. Justice had cost shareholders lost faith for a time. Projects were delayed, and colleagues who had nothing to do with the mistake bore the fallout. Yet the system's most dangerous thing, untouchability, had been pierced. Jason's invulnerability was gone. Employees watched the changes ripple through the company in stunned silence. Some thanked me in whispers. Others avoided me, wary of being dragged into more storms. I returned to my desk the next week and resumed my work. The office resumed its grind. But there was a subtle shift. People were more careful with signatures, more vocal about oversight, and less inclined to bow to inherited authority. The exposure didn't fix everything. It didn't heal the years of toxicity or erase the subtle ways power had warped the workplace. But it proved one durable truth: arrogance that ignores detail can be undone by the detail itself. And when it did, the company, wounded but alive, had to choose whether to rebuild on accountability or on the same old compromises. Jason's downfall wasn't explosive. There were no headlines splashed across newspapers, no dramatic firings broadcast to the entire company. That wasn't how men like Mr. Hawthorne operated. Power doesn't vanish in public, it's quietly reshuffled behind closed doors. But even in its silence, the outcome was unmistakable. Jason was gone. And everyone knew why. The day after the board meeting, Jason's office door stayed locked. His nameplate vanished within a week. The official memo that circulated painted it as a strategic reassignment, but no one bought it. Employees traded whispers in elevators in the cafeteria in hushed tones over coffee. "Did you hear?" It was the supplier contract. He signed something disastrous. Some versions exaggerated, others downplayed, but all had the same conclusion: Jason had fallen. For me, there was no applause, no medal, and I didn't want one. My victory was quieter, more personal. Every time I walked down the corridor and saw people working without the shadow of Jason's tantrums looming, I felt the weight lift. Meetings were calmer. Fewer all-nighters were demanded for no reason. Colleagues who once flinched at his name began to relax, some even smiling again in the workplace. That shift in atmosphere was reward enough. Mr. Hawthorne, however, was a man transformed. The prideful CEO, who had once paraded his son as the company's future, avoided mentioning him altogether. If Jason's name surfaced, his father's jaw tightened, and the subject shifted swiftly. It was clear the humiliation burned deep. But Hawthorne Sr. was also a pragmatist. His son's blunder had nearly cost him millions. And in business, even family ties can snap under that kind of pressure. I expected retaliation, perhaps subtle punishment for embarrassing the Hawthorne family. But it never came. Instead, Mr. Hawthorne treated me with a new, measured respect. He never thanked me. Men like him rarely admit weakness, but he listened when I spoke in meetings, and compliance memos suddenly carried more weight. He may have hated the messenger, but he couldn't ignore the message. Details mattered, and those who understood them were not expendable. As for Jason, rumors trickled back occasionally. He'd been parked in a satellite office overseas, some said. Others claimed he was being groomed quietly for a future return once things cooled down. But to those of us who had endured his arrogance firsthand, his exile was justice enough. Whether he clawed his way back or not didn't matter. The illusion of his untouchability was gone forever. The office, too, learned a lesson. For years, Jason had been proof that power flowed from bloodlines, not competence. Now, his removal was proof of the opposite. Even the CEO's son could fall if the evidence was undeniable. People began speaking up more in meetings, questioning reckless shortcuts. Legal reviews weren't brushed aside as bureaucratic nonsense. It wasn't revolution, but it was a shift. One I had sparked, even if no one said it aloud. In quiet moments, I thought about what I had done. Revenge had fueled me at first, the raw desire to see Jason punished for humiliating me, for making me his scapegoat. But what I gained in the end wasn't just revenge. It was vindication. Proof that I wasn't invisible, that the work I did, the clauses, the details, the diligence wasn't meaningless. It could topple giants. And yet I didn't strut, I didn't gloat. I returned to my desk like nothing had changed. Because in corporate life, victories aren't parades, they're survival. And survival, I had learned, is often best served in silence. Jason had once mocked me for caring about the fine print. "That's why we have compliance, nerds," he had sneered. Now, his career lay in ruins because of one line he never read that I thought was justice enough.